Hello and welcome. Welcome to our trust in automated decision-making session. Just to start with, I'm very jet-lagged. Any chaos or errors or anything that goes wrong at all in this session is completely down to that, and it's all my fault. So just keep that in mind. I do know that this is the panel about trust, and I'm really trust me. But I've been really excited about us holding this panel. We've been waiting a long time to have an in-person discussion of trust. And this panel is connected to our Trust in Automated Decision Making project, which is part of ADM+S. And for me, it's so important that we have a research project and theme within the centre that focuses on trust. At the core of my own research agenda is this question of how we might move forward into trusted futures. So future lives, future environments, and future relationships that are characterized by feelings of trust. And in this context, in particular, trust in relation to automation. It means living in a world where the design, the development, and the use of automated technologies are attentive to the ethics, to the relations of power, and to everyday values. So why trust? I mean, why are we talking and thinking about trust? I think on a personal level for me, in terms of my research, quite a few years ago, I realized that most of the companies and outside university sector partners that I was doing research with and collaborating with were increasingly talking about trust, especially when they spoke about what we might call their digital transformation of their organizations to automated technologies and systems. They're concerned with trust. So these are organizations involved with self-driving cars, or the question of what is the meaning of digital assets, another project we worked on in the past, the future of insurance, the design of smartphone apps, smartphones and smart city tech. All of these research partners were concerned with trust. And the concept of trust then has become a core strand of my work in the emerging technologies labs, and it's one of these essential concepts I think that we need to address within the Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society, not just from the perspective of the people programme and the Monash node where I'm based, but across the whole of the centre. One of the most interesting things about trust is that it's a concept that's used across disciplines, but it actually tends to be used different ways and have different meanings when it's used in engineering, when it's used in computer science, when it's used in anthropology and sociology, philosophy, when it's used in organizations outside academia. But there's some core, if you like, common understanding. So for me, it's one of those concepts that we can use to speak to each other across different academic disciplines, across different sectors, and between different stakeholders. Now, one of the projects then that I lead in ADM+S is the Trust in ADM project. And Emma Quilter, who you'll hear from later, has been working with me on that project, and as have my colleagues in Sweden who are also part of ADM+S and who couldn't be here for the conference. The project investigates trust across these different sectors and the different domains that automated tech are being developed, designed, and experienced in. We have a suite of ongoing projects which include a study of how stakeholders in our tech futures understand the question of trust, and that's one that Emma and I have been working on together. It also includes questions around how software engineers understand trust when they're working on software. It includes the question of how different understandings of trust compare and intersect in an interdisciplinary mobility as a service research project that I'm part of in Sweden. It includes questions about if people might trust self-driving cars or not, how social workers trust when they're using digital tech to work with families for the first time. We also have some more theoretical projects which investigate the relationship between ethics and trust. And we had the book launch for our Everyday Automation book today. That's where part of that book addresses that question between ethics and trust in everyday life. We look at the questions of trust and uncertainty and trust and futures. Trust is essentially a future-oriented concept. It's about what might happen next in many, many senses. Also, some of our ADM+S PhD students are using the concept of trust, for example, to understand how people experiencing the use of car seat restraints for disabled kids, also how people experience city data collection and how data is used in cities. We also have a trust in automated decision-making reading group, which Emma runs, and a trust in ADM research network, which goes right across the centre, which I'd love people to sign up to and to join us in our meetings for. So this concept of trust then really does offer us a space in which to consider automated futures together across our different disciplines and across the different programmes and focus areas of the centre. It enables other sectors and stakeholders in our futures to join us as academics in the centre to talk about things through the same conceptual window, if you like. It's not an easy task. It's not something that we'll be able to solve today, the question of trust, what it means and how it matters for us going forward. But I'd like us to make a start today. I'd like us to create a forum in which we can seed those dialogues that need to take place in our Centre for Automated Decision-Making in Society with each other and with our partners from other organisations. So that's enough from me. I want to now just let you watch a short film, which Jenny Lee, who is somewhere here in the room, here, our wonderful Jenny, who's our fantastic documentary filmmaker, whose films you also screened last night. Jenny's put together a short piece for us, just to prompt us to think about trust and to show some of the various contexts in which we've been thinking about it in our work in everyday life through our ethnographic practice.
I often use my phone at least to kind of check my general location, or even just simple sometimes as being like, Siri, where am I? To make sure I'm on the right track. It kind of is my eyes, I suppose.
How would you feel about an energy company remote controlling one of your appliances during a peak time, but giving you an incentive, so giving you like a financial reward? So cycling your air conditioner on and off for a period of time.
We don't want
we would like to be
notified. We would like to get that information.
We will not allow for remote control unless it is imposed by government.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Why not?
However, I do need override button.
Automation is not for me because I think it takes choice away, and I'm a control freak, so I like to have control over my environment. So
they sent me one of those. It's an Echo Dot. I actually am quite worried about it because I think it taps into you.
I trust Google Maps most of the time because it is fairly accurate and it has helped me a lot to get to places where I need to go.
Central shopping centre. Can we go now? Vacant set. Yep, let's do it.
Sometimes I would like to have both options, using people and using technology. I would not like to use an automatic car because it's risky.
Driverless cars are unsafe. The thing that would worry me about driverless cars, I suppose, is if everyone has one, it's fine. When there's AI mixed with humans control, then it could potentially clash.
I think what makes me nervous about the idea of, these self-driving cars coming out, I've always drawn confidence from knowing that 99% of the time drivers are looking where they're going and they will see me coming. And it makes me nervous that this technology will not be able to do that with the same care as a living, breathing person.
Okay, so just also to give a few credits, some of the clips that we saw in that piece have also come from our latest documentary from our ARC linkage project, Digital Energy Futures. So I'd like to invite our panel to come up. Our youngest panel member is only 5 weeks old. So we like to attract people of all ages to our work. Okay, so first I'll introduce our 4 speakers and then we'll be hearing from them. So here, first we have Lizzie O'Shea for Digital Rights Watch. So Lizzie is a lawyer and a writer. Her commentary about law, technology and human rights has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian and the Sydney Morning Herald, amongst others. Lizzie is a co-founder and the chair of Digital Right Watch, which advocates for human rights online. And she also has an amazing son, as well as something else that she has produced, which is her book, Future Histories, which looks at radical social movements and theorists. So Lizzie will be speaking to us about procedural and regulatory safeguards from a rights perspective, which includes or should include the right to refuse these systems. So next to Lizzie, we have Nicole Gillespie. Nicole is a professor who holds the KPMG chair in trust at the University of Queensland, where Nicole co-leads the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance. Nicole's also an international research fellow at Oxford University. Her research over the past 20 years has focused on developing and repairing trust, with recent work focused on trust in AI and ADM. Nicole's recent research reports with KPMG provide practical guidance on achieving trustworthy AI and public trust in AI. She's currently leading a global study examining public trust in AI and an examination of stakeholder trust in public sector AI-enabled services. And Nicole's going to discuss with us insights from their research on public trust in AI and ADM. So next to Nicole is Emma Quilty from Monash from the Emerging Technologies Lab, where Emma's a postdoctoral research fellow. Emma investigates the question of trust theoretically and ethnographically across research about automated technologies and transition to net zero as part of our ARC linkage project, Net Zero Precincts, and focusing also on transport and mobilities. Emma has expertise in ethnographic research methods with a focus on embodied, feminist and sensory methods. And she also leads our vibrant Trust in ADM reading group. If you'd like to join the reading group, please contact Emma. And finally, we have Kath Aubrey, also from ADM+S. Professor Kath Aubrey is an ARC Future Fellow and an Associate Investigator in the Swinburne University of Technology node of ADM+S. And Kath also co-leads the Digital Inclusion and Participation Programme in Swinburne Social Innovation Research Institute. Kath's most recent co-authored book, which was actually launched today, is called Everyday Data Cultures with Jean Burgess, Anthony McCosker and Rowan Wilkin, published by Polity in June. So it's such a mouthful getting out all of those amazing things that everybody in the panel is doing that I'm quite relieved that that part of this session is over now, although it was just a complete delight to present for such amazing women. So our first speaker is Nicole. So would you like to come up and take the podium?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. Sarah asked us to talk a little bit about, definitions of trust and also some insights from our recent survey work. So to begin with, I'll just talk a bit about how we conceptualize trust. We adopt a definition which is pretty dominant in the literatures and disciplines we use, and I see it a lot across the social sciences. So we see trust as the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another party or entity, so that can be a ADM type system, and we are willing to be vulnerable in that way based on positive expectations of the intentions or actions of that entity or party. So I think what's really helpful about this definition is it really highlights that trust is central, vulnerability is central to the definition of trust. We know that trust is really only relevant under conditions of risk or uncertainty. So when there's something that is important at stake. And this is why I think, to answer Sarah's second question of why is trust so fundamental to ADM and AI type systems, well, we know that the use of these systems open up multiple potential risks. I think one of them is particularly that idea of inaccurate or biased decision making, which can, of course, then rapidly escalate up when done in an automated way. And we saw that occur with the robo-debt. We did a bit of a case analysis, which we published on robo-debt, and we can see the harm that that caused to some of the most vulnerable people in our population. Now, of course, there's lots of other ways and risks that ADM opens up. We've seen examples of how it's resulted in discrimination in areas such as hiring, in terms of parole decisions, medical care, etc. So these sort of examples really raise, I think, in the public's mind the question of how trustworthy are these systems. And I think in the context of these systems being rapidly deployed in our society, we can really understand trust as a way to both respond to and manage the vulnerability in this context. Now, trust is also critical, of course, because it underpins acceptance, adoption, and the social license to use these technologies. In our research that we're currently conducting, looking at trust in public sector service delivery using AI and ADM, we've documented numerous cases where the technology itself was well advanced and actually performing very well with the validation and testing, but it didn't progress past the piloting stage. Why? Because key stakeholders didn't trust not necessarily the technology, but the organisation that was deploying the technology to do that well. So, look, given the importance and relevance of trust, this is one of the reasons that really spurred us on to doing work examining public trust in AI systems, and particularly also in expectations for the management and governance of these systems. So we surveyed nationally representative samples both here in Australia, in the US, in Canada, in Germany, and the UK, so over 6,000 people in total. And some of our key insights, well, first of all, we found that trust levels actually quite low. So we found that 72% of people are wary of trusting these kind of systems. So that manifests in them being either unwilling or ambivalent to rely on the outcomes of these systems, so their decisions and recommendations, or unwilling to share their data with these systems to make them work. We also, though, found that the purpose and context of the technology use makes a difference. So, for example, we found people are more trusting of AI use in the healthcare context to diagnose disease and inform treatment than they are, say, in HR contexts where it's being used to select job candidates for roles. We also found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the majority of people, 81%, expect AI to be regulated. However, we found 2/3 of people don't believe that current regulations and laws are sufficient to make AI use safe. So one important pathway that we identified is, the need to strengthen the regulatory and legal framework around this, and importantly to ensure that it's really fit for purpose and is communicated to the public so that they understand that it's in place. We also found that people are more likely to trust when there's structural assurance mechanisms in place. So, for example, when they know that an independent board has reviewed the ethical, the ethics of a system before it's released. And this is really understandable that people want these kind of assurances, given one, people typically can't evaluate the trustworthiness of these tools necessarily themselves, and they see the impact of these tools on society as uncertain and unpredictable. We also found that most people, 60%, don't feel that they understand these systems well. And that was even in everyday application. So I was really surprised to see that, we find 3/4 of people use social media, for example, but only 2 in 5 actually have any awareness that social media uses any of these kind of AI type systems. So if people don't understand how these systems are being used, how their data is being used, how the information that they're receiving is being filtered, it's really hard for them to understand what appropriate use is for that, and also to really be informed about their acceptance of these technologies. So again, another pathway forward, I would advocate for is really enhancing people's understanding of that these systems are being used and how these systems are working, so that they can make more informed decisions about their use and acceptance of the systems, and also be more informed about what is required for these systems to be used in a responsible and trustworthy way. So the final insight from our survey was that people are actually very clear on the expectations around principles and practices that they want to see in place in order to trust these technologies. So we did a synthesis of a lot of the AI ethical frameworks, principles for trustworthy AI, Many of you will be familiar with these. And we reduced it down to a set of 34 practices. And we asked people how important are each of these practices for you to trust in these technologies. So the organisations are using these practices that are deploying those technologies. We found 95% across these 6,000 people said that each of these practices were important for their trust. So that really shows in our mind a strong public endorsement for them. And so that's why one of the reasons why we've worked with KPMG to produce a practical framework and guidance to organisations on how they can go about using these technologies in a way that secures stakeholder trust and ensures the trustworthiness of these kind of technologies. And I'm happy to say that we're back in the field and now we're extending our survey of public trust in AI to 17 countries. So I hope to be able to come back to you at some point in the maybe 3 or 4 months' time with an understanding of cross-cultural views on this as well. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to do my best. As you can see, I'm very motivated to come to this panel because I think it's a really interesting question and I'm really grateful to be invited. So thanks so much for that, Sarah. And I think it's really interesting that we're going to have different perspectives and you can't talk about much in just 5 minutes, but I think the interactions between us will be interesting. So I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm also the chair of a digital rights advocacy organisation. And when I think about automated decision-making processes, I think about the outcome of those processes. And from a human rights perspective, applying a human rights approach, my view is that people ought to be entitled to be treated as individuals. They have the right to be treated with dignity, which almost sits conceptually in an opposing position to automated decision-making processes, which are designed to make decisions at scale about cohorts of people based on particular characteristics. Quite the opposite. Now, that's not always a bad thing, I should say. Obviously, automated decision-making models can save time and money, especially for vulnerable people. They can be of great use to society. They can expose harmful conduct as well as conceal it. But trust in these processes, I think, is really only possible where there are appropriate accountability mechanisms, where it's regulated from the get-go to include an appropriate and intentional allocation of liability. So that can mean, of course, the right to have a decision explained, but critically, I think it also means the right to an appeal. And that appeal of decisions should be fast, it should be free, it should be very easy, because without that, you're simply then socialising the costs of a bad model, and you're actually failing to take the opportunity to incorporate feedback and improvement into a model if you don't make space for appeals and build that into a system. And when those decisions are made to not offer accountability in automated decision-making processes, it's hard sometimes to believe that that's by accident, that in fact it may be by design. And to that extent, I think as a human rights practitioner, I think automation is invariably a function of power and it's a function of politics. And that's something that always needs to be kept in mind. So it's not just about optimizing models, it's also about considering who are the winners and losers in these models. Then mistakes will invariably happen because there will be always individual cases that fall foul of the process, and we need to make accommodation for that, to not necessarily presume that they can be designed away. The other thing that I think is really important to consider from a human rights perspective in automated decision-making models is that there are other digital rights that come into play. I like the approach of Kate Crawford. If you've read her book about artificial intelligence, she looks at the material foundations of artificial intelligence. And I think this is a worthwhile approach to any kind of automated decision-making model as well. So automated processes are built on data. Too often that data has been expropriated without consent, and people have contributed data to all sorts of automated processes without even knowing. It relies on thousands of human decisions to classify that data and to train it in a particular way, as well as then ultimately the decisions of how you design a model on top of that. And these kinds of classifications decisions, obviously, of course, then the actual modelling decisions can be based on discriminatory assumptions. If you consider how you might allocate issues concerning race or gender, these things are very complex in the real world, but can be flattened into very simple concepts in automated decision-making models, which lend towards discriminatory conduct. So what I'm getting at is that trust is not just about outcomes in automated decision-making processes. It's not just about auditing for certain kinds of outcomes and then seeking to improve or fix them. It's also about building respect for rights at all stages of the development of a particular model. And trust just can't be earned in these models without respect for the right to privacy, the right to be free from discrimination, and that ought to be incorporated from the beginning of any process. This sort of brings me to the last point, the last minute in my 5, which is, I think for automated decision-making models to actually have trust, there needs to be a right of refusal. It's really about determining what is the necessary elements of the social license in order to make use of automated decision-making models rather than imposing them on people without consent. In international law, Indigenous people, they have a declaration about their rights, and one of the concepts that's central to that is free, prior, informed consent. And I think it's an interesting concept to reapply in the context of automated decision-making models as well, because that is the necessary elements to have true trust in the system. If there's no right to refuse an automated decision being imposed upon you, then how can you really trust that it will work for you? And how can you ensure that you have a social license to operate? And that, I think, is a critical component then of earning the social license to use these kinds of models. So those are my 3 things that I think are most important when applying a human rights lens to automated decision-making process: to think about outcomes and how you can avoid bad outcomes, of course, and how you can incorporate feedback and appeals into that, to consider other digital rights like the right to privacy and the right to be free from discrimination. And then lastly, to consider the social license to operate and how we can make sure that there's a right to refusal being built into these processes, rather than always assuming that automated decision-making is superior to existing forms of decision-making in the real world. Thank you.
Lizzie, and thank you, Henry. That was brilliant, and I think I can already see some threads across all of our papers, so this is going to be brilliant. And what I'm going to talk to actually links in with that social contract, that social license. So what I'm going to be unpacking is the relationship between trust and mistrust, and while it will be in the context of automation in the transport industry, what I'm going to be talking about, I think, can travel really well across into sex tech and fintech and law and AI. So trust is a really crucial component of the social contract between people and driverless systems. So Jack Stilgo, we all know and love, argues that trust is out of the control of innovators and regulators, and that whilst it can be designed for, trust itself is something that the public bestows as a gift. So I agree with at least the first part of that argument, that it is out of the control of the innovators and regulators. However, the idea of trust being something that can be designed for and gifted frames it as a rational choice and as a static state, as a material thing. But from an anthropological perspective, trust is better conceptualized as a more fluid and emergent and from contingent circumstances of everyday life. So trust in a driverless future operates on 2 levels. So there's trust in the vehicles themselves as a technological artifact, and then there's trust in the systems that govern the technology. So for societal trust in a new technology, we all know it matters that these processes are open, inclusive, and transparent, but those conditions might not be sufficient. So trust is not simply a gift, a transaction between 2 parties. It's a leap of faith. So treating trust as a desirable goal, as an end in and of itself, frames mistrust as something that needs to be avoided at all costs. And this ignores the generative potential of mistrust. So in the development of trust, mistrust plays a really important role in the negotiation process of this social contract. Mistrust opens up the possibility of problematizing who is and who is not heard and recognized in the design of the future. So I say mistrust, not distrust. And while Google says they're technically the same thing, there is a subtle but important difference. So while distrust is based on prior experience, mistrust is more affective. It's a feeling of unease and wariness that you shouldn't trust something or someone. So rather than treating trust as a willingness to become vulnerable, I treat trust and mistrust as feelings that anticipate sensations and experiences, and they allow us to explore where things become possible. So a lot of the earlier social science literature describes trust as a type of social glue. essential for societies to function. So Giddens said that without general trust, people having each other, society itself would disintegrate. So underpinning a lot of this work is this assumption that trust, broadly speaking, it's a good thing. It's good for the individual and it's good for the community. The more we have of this thing, the better. In this dichotomy, trust builds relationships and mistrust undermines them. Trust breeds wealth, mistrust generates poverty, trust gives rise to effective communication and extensive social ties. Mistrust is the mother of confusion and isolation. In this sense, in this kind of framework, mistrust is corrosive of human bonds. It becomes a kind of social acid. So unsurprisingly, there's little room within this framework for a more nuanced discussion of mistrust. So mistrust, I'm arguing, is not the absence of trust, it's an invitation. So I like to use Nietzsche's definition of mistrust as a source of truthfulness, as something that necessitates tension, observation, and reflection. So in governance literature, deep-rooted mistrust is considered to be the central obstacle to the democratic transition of societies. In order to overcome this obstacle, we need confidence-building measures, and these are regarded as essential. Mistrust is often seen as an indicator of failure, and once this has been identified, we need mechanisms like checklists and policies mobilized to overcome this obstacle of mistrust. But again, this approach to trust frames it as this rational transactional relationship between two entities, and it ignores that thing that is really hard to grasp onto and explain, which cannot be crammed neatly into a formula where you do X, Y, Z, and then you get trust as the outcome. So putting trust in another involves an element of risk, willingness to get involved, to commit to something, to be vulnerable, in other words, to take a leap of faith. This is the best way I have seen this really ephemeral part of trust being described. Of course, certain background conditions are needed for these leaps to occur. Insights into these conditions by anthropologists such as Sarah Pink reveal that it is something that is experienced when things feel right, a sensation often achieved by repeating mundane everyday routines. So even if all the trustworthy principles and protocols are in place for new technologies such as automated vehicles, they meet the correct safety criteria and the technology is classified as trustworthy, there is no guarantee that people will take that necessary leap of faith. Whether trust will emerge and endure remains open. I propose that we need to take this openness and ambiguity of this concept seriously and leave behind the dichotomy of trust as a desirable goal and mistrust as something to be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm talking about the relationship between trust and consent, following on pretty nicely, I think, from what's been said so far. And I'm going to use some observations drawn from recent research projects on dating apps and more recently the kind of broader space of sex tech, and a recent article that from the journal Crime, Media and Culture, which was co-authored with Sarah Stardust, who's here, and our other ADMS colleague, Rosalie Gillett, who unfortunately is not. But one of the things that we think about in that article is the way that consent has been understood in the kind of public discourse around dating app safety solutions, and also in public conversations about things like consent apps and whether they will make people who use dating apps or who don't use dating apps safer. And one of the things that we think about and talk about in that article is this kind of what we see as a kind of paradoxical notion here. So a tech developer is telling us that they can make in-app dating safer by automating consent for us. It's been proposed to, establish sexual consent through the blockchain, or just, so much safer. Who is not being trusted in this process, and who we consider to be trustworthy are interesting questions, and I would say very gendered questions, but we can put that aside right now. In the article that Zara and Rosie and I put together, we kind of flip this argument and say, maybe tech developers and other people working in the space of ADM could learn about consent and trust from the people who coined the phrase consent culture, that is sex workers and BDSM players, who have a much more dynamic and contingent notion of consent that's much less transactional and not so much of an on-off toggle, but a kind of ongoing conversational and relational process. In thinking about sex tech and dating apps too, I've been thinking through the Everyday Data Cultures project about the ways that sexual and romantic relationships are not so much datafied through sex tech and dating apps, but that sex tech and dating apps pick up on long histories of understanding our bodies and our genders and our sexualities as forms of data through demographics, through social service provision. You know, a lot of us here have read Foucault. I don't need to go through all of that. But that these new modes of datification intersect with these older modes of datification in interesting ways. So assuming, you know, what is the normal or appropriate progress of a relationship, who gives consent and who takes consent, or who must receive consent, and how that works. In a recent study conducted by Steve Roberts and Sina Ravan, talking with young men about sexting and their views on sexting in the kind of establishment of relationships. In the presentation of that paper at the Digital Intimacies Conference, there was a really interesting conversation about the algorithmic nature of the dating process, so the sexting process. So rather than it being a discussion of the kind of more aggressive image-based abuse, like sending an unsolicited dick pic or demanding nudes, it was a conversation about the ways that flirtations or relationships or in-app chat progresses through a kind of algorithmic process where each participant would like to receive a little more, would like to reveal a little more. This is how dating works. Like, how much do I hide? How much do I show? But you only want to add the right amount of disclosure at each moment, and you only want to request the right amount of disclosure at each moment. And if at any point you demand too much or you give too much, there's a sense that the calculation will fall over, that the algorithm will break. Similarly, on dating apps, if we receive safety advice, particularly me as a cisgendered woman, I might be told, you know, be careful with what you show on apps. Don't show too many pictures. Don't link it to your external Facebook page. Don't. But if I want to trust another person, I would like to be able to look at their social media accounts. Indeed, when we did work with dating app users, asking them what made them feel safer or less safe, many people liked to look at their date or their matches' other social media accounts as a form of, you know, two-factor authentication, you know, vernacular terms. Is this person who they say they are? Do I like the look of their friends? Do we have friends in common? Do they go places I would like to go? Do they like the kind of music that I like to? So we would like to establish intimacy through disclosure, but at the same time, there's a sense that if I over disclose, can I trust you not to take advantage of me or not to push me away for oversharing? You know, what is the calculation that I'm engaging in here as I'm trying to establish trust through a kind of process of mediation? But when it comes to consent apps, and I've looked at a couple, the iFling app is a Danish app, and the New South Wales Police Minister recently suggested that something would be great to attach something like that to Tinder. And, you know, what a wonderful idea. The forms of consent, or the understanding of consent offered in those apps is very binary. And as I said, it's a toggle. Are you interested in sexting? Yes, no. It's like, well, what do you mean by sexting? Is it a picture of my cute bra? Is it a full body shot with all my tattoos and other identifying features? Is it a genital picture? Is it an arty mirror over the shoulder, like what? And if I consent to sexting, is that your picture now? Can you show it to your mates? Can you put it on a Facebook page? There's no sense in which we are negotiating this together. It's simply a transaction. And so I guess, we'll explore this more in the conversation, but I would say if we're thinking about kind of mediated consent or automated consent through the lens of sexual consent, I think we go back to those kind of interpersonal and effective considerations that everyone's been talking about here so much. So if you want me to trust you, this has to be something that we negotiate together, not something that I give and you receive. And that's the end.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's great to see that kind of broader shift away from transactional kind of definitions and approaches to trust towards understandings of trust as actually being something quite different, kind of becoming part of the circumstances in which people find themselves and being considerably more contingent. And I think that's one of the big contributions that we can make in interdisciplinary discussions, is to actually try to shift some of those definitions and shift some of the dominant definitions that are still used in technology design and information technology and human-computer interaction disciplines very frequently. I've got a few initial questions to ask our speakers, while just to give all of you a bit more time to think about what you would like, questions you would like to pose to them all from the audience. First, I wanted to ask you, Nicole, how would you say that, well, I suppose there's one thing I'd also say first, because I know that you spoke a lot about your questionnaires and your studies, but I know we've also had conversations about, your definitions of trust and the questions around kind of getting beyond that transactional kind of definition. I'd love to hear more from you about that, but also the question that I was going to pose is also related to that, is how can organizations build trust in their use of ADM and AI?
So I think, it's interesting to hear the kind of dichotomies that people are picking up here, because I think in my mind, trust is dynamic, trust is contextual. And to me, that doesn't oppose with this definition of a willingness to be vulnerable. And the willingness to be vulnerable is very effective. Like you think about yourself, when you're experiencing a vulnerability, the salient emotion there is affect, right? But then how do you manage that vulnerability? How do you go forward knowing in any interaction we have, there's always a sense of vulnerability if we're relying on other people to do something, if we're interdependent with them, or indeed technology itself. So we need to find ways of managing that. And one way of managing that is my world really at the heart of trust, is to look for good reasons, right, to do that, to get over that affective kind of thing. And reason and affect, as we know, I'm a psychologist by training, are very closely intertwined. So often we think that it's a cognition that's coming first, when actually it's an affect coming first. Okay, so that's a very complex kind of area, but really affect and cognition are very closely entwined together. So I think and this whole idea of trust and distrust is absolutely functional, right? And mistrust is functional too, because it's warning us in many ways to say, actually, I'm not ready in this situation to trust, not ready to be vulnerable. And there's often very good reasons for that. Sometimes those reasons are beyond our conscious awareness. It's not even reasoning in our mind, but there's a warning bell, okay, that we know in this situation we should be careful. So I think that's where, to me, and in fact, I work with Guido Mollering a lot, who's a sociologist who his book talks about trust as reason, routine, and reflexivity. And he uses this definition of willingness to be vulnerable based on positive expectations. And he's one of the ones that's perhaps most dominant in coining this term of the leap of faith, because trust is still a leap of faith in the sense that we still have a sense of vulnerability. We can never completely extract that vulnerability unless we go into contexts where everything is completely controlled, which is just not typically feasible. So I think in the context of all of that, of just sort of clarifying that there's a lot more depth to I think the discussion there. In terms of how organizations can build I think that there's like a multi-pronged approach. It's not any one thing. However, I do think that first of all, they need to recognise, well, whose trust do they need to have? Okay, and I think that's not only often the people who are affected by the technology. We often focus on them, and absolutely they're critical. But there's a lot of other people who are stakeholders, if you like. So and a lot of our work has been exploring around the idea that different stakeholders to trust actually have different types of vulnerability in relation to it. So developers of these technologies are vulnerable. Those who are deploying these systems are vulnerable in the sense of accountability. And that's one of the reasons which holds back a lot, is because we haven't worked out mechanisms of accountability and consent, etc. So I think part of it is really thinking through all of the stakeholders, mapping those stakeholders who are affected by any particular technology, really deeply listening to those stakeholders during the design and development, co-designing, or at least consultation through the process is really critical to that trust building. And then, I do think that there is a role for these principles and practices as well in doing that. And I think it's not as simple as just saying, well, we know, probably captures very simple. We know that these principles and practices are important, but actually putting them into practice is very difficult because there's a lot of tensions inherent in doing that.
Kathleen, looked like you had something to say around some of these questions. So I wanted to ask you a question next. I mean, the question I was going to ask you actually is quite simple, is trust a prerequisite for consent? But I think it would be good to also kind of answer that in the context of this discussion we're having about that really interesting question around, the relationship between the cognitive and the affective, or the the representational, the non-representational, those different, and the reflexive, which you also brought up, Nicole, which I think is really important, because we're always, I think, as academics, we're always bouncing between those questions. I mean, in all disciplines, we do in anthropology and in media and communication studies a lot as well. There's that question around representation and non-representation, and the felt and the thoughts. And so I was wondering how that fits.
Yeah, I mean, it's and again, I'm going to talk about a kind of concrete example applied to sexual consent, because that's how I've been thinking about it. So there's, consent education is now a big thing. And one of the messages in consent education is often around the prerequisite of enthusiastic consent. There must be enthusiastic consent, but there is also a kind of pushback or critique around that, saying, well, people aren't always enthusiastic when they're consenting. Like in terms of sexual relationships, there are all kinds of reasons why people might consent, for example, to try a new thing that they're curious about, but they're uncertain, or they have a history of trauma and they're not sure how they will go. But in the context of this particular relationship, they'd like to try, or it's part of their job and it's a thing they're paid money for. And, most of us wouldn't say we're enthusiastic about every aspect of our job, but, it doesn't mean we're not consenting to do the work. So there are all of these different elements which, operate at the level of affect, but sometimes are quite rational too. And it's hard to tease the one out from the other. But I think in that kind of, still in the kind of consent culture conversations, the prerequisite for trust is always that I need to trust you to understand that consent may be withdrawn. And that's the bit, I think, that is more difficult when it comes to our current tech cultures or our current cultures of automation, because once you're in, there's almost no way out. That's... Or unless you go full social dilemma, like, and blow everything up. But we know that's not realistic for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Lizzie, I wanted to ask you, I think also reflecting a bit on this same question about, what is trust, or what kinds of layers of trust are there? But I wanted to ask you this question of, is trust, whatever trust is, always achievable in ADM models?
Yeah, I think it's interesting listening to this panel, because I realise my conception of trust is just deeply informed by the fact that I'm a lawyer, so I feel like I'm a hammer and everything looks like a nail. But I mean, I would say I think a lot of these approaches are kind of complementary, or they're coming at the problem from different angles, but it gives you greater insight into the whole concept of trust, which is obviously feels very everyday and mundane, but is in fact more complex than I think everyone realizes, including me. And so what I would say is I am motivated to think about the process, you know, the process of having a decision made about you by a machine. That can look like magic. It can look superior to human decision-making. Both of those things are untrue often, and it's how you then resolve those tensions and give the individual who's had an imposition made on them the opportunity to be perceived, understood with dignity and the right to be heard, you know, to be taken seriously as a person up against a machine. And, you know, until we can guarantee that that is available to all people who will be subjected to these kinds of processes, then we can't really say, I think, as a society that they're trustworthy, because there'll be harm created and those consequences are left to be borne by someone who's vulnerable, who's without power traditionally in society, and that ought to be a problem for us. So, I mean, that's how I perceive it, that there's a process of these decisions being made. That design involves rights, it involves considerations, I agree, at all different levels, developers as well as people who are purchasing this, who are then deploying it, but then also the individual in question, that if we're going to invest in these processes, then we have to make sure that they're trustworthy. And I think absolutely there's times where it cannot be so. And so in those circumstances, it shouldn't happen. I mean, I think I keep returning to Stafford Beer's maxim that the purpose of a system is what it does. If you look at something like robo-debt, that should never have happened, right? But it did, and it worked well for the government of the day, I have to say. You know, if the purpose of that system was to recover money and to make welfare recipients feel intimidated, then I think it was successful. And if it fuels a political narrative that vulnerable people who use the welfare system should be subjected to more rigorous scientific processes in order to do that they're not rights holders, that they're people we impose things upon, that they don't have a right or a stake in society to be able to be treated with dignity, notwithstanding that they're receiving welfare, then, you know, that system worked. It did create that dynamic, and that's extremely troubling. We should be able to say no. And if we don't have the social capacity to do that, then we should be arguing against it. And so I would be for treading more cautiously rather than moving fast and breaking things, as I'm sure many in this room would agree with. And that ought to be one of our primary motivations in examining automated decision-making systems.
Thank you. And Emma, I think kind of thinking about this context of, you know, what is trust and the, you know, the more cognitive and reflexive and affective dimensions of it, what does that tell us about mistrust and how we can conceptualize mistrust?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of our work with the software engineers. I'm thinking about an example, I like to go to the concrete, the ethnography, an interview I did with a software engineer who works in an underground mine in coal seam gas, and they've just recently implemented some AI software to automate that system. And as many of you know, in the mining system, it takes a long time to get anything new into a mine. And it costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of investment. And there was a lot of consultation, I think 0 consultation done with the staff. And in this particular mine, the cohort that this software engineer was overseeing was split into the young boys and the old boys. So the old boys had been working in the mine for 20, 30 years. They had their processes, they had their automated processes, and that was how they did it, by touch and feel. And so this new thing that they couldn't communicate, that didn't have this kind of, they didn't have an embodied relationship with this technology, they mistrusted it completely. So they would intervene. And so the software engineer who was overseeing it was constantly getting reports at the end of the week that they were interfering with the process. And so they were messing up the information that was meant to be going back into the machine. So I think it really comes back to this idea that yes, consultation, but also co-design, like this kind of, the software engineers need to get beyond this idea of just working with a client and working with the people who are going to be using this on the ground. Need some more anthropologists in the mix.
Yeah, we always need more anthropologists. Anyway, let's open up to the audience. So who would like to ask the first question? I have more questions if nobody has one, but somebody must. Yeah, or we have 2. I think one there, and there. So the first person was the person in the middle of the room.
Hi, I'm Jigya Khabar. I'm a PhD candidate at Monash University, and thanks to the entire panel kind of giving us different views on what trust means in ADM. And one of the things from my study that I have kind of like understood is that I'm studying information systems in social services sector in Bangladesh. So the context is very different from, maybe Australian social services sector. And in terms of mistrust in the actual sustainability of the digital or the information system. So is there something that maybe, because I know that Nicole pointed out about the regulatory framework and governance, like trust in the governance of ADM, but is there something that you've actually found, or is there a discussion around the actual the trust in the actual sustainability of the system itself? Like long-term use or long-term understanding of if the systems will come into place.
Yeah, sure. So I guess one aspect that's perhaps speaks to that is just obviously the life cycle of AI or any of these different systems. And I think, that's very much how it's understood as a life cycle. Yet I would say that, at least in my experience from what I've seen and heard people who are actually on the ground using and developing these systems is that having in place the right sort of governance mechanisms for that life cycle view to really be able to evaluate. So I think things like continuous monitoring and evaluation of the accuracy, how does it perform any system in different contexts, extreme contexts, putting it through testing of red teams and that, where the deliberate approach is to try to circumvent or manipulate or take advantage of the system in some way or corrupt it. So I mean, I think all of those different things, we know a lot about how to, I think, make these systems sort of secure. I don't know how much we know about when these should be decommissioned, but I would imagine that that's built into that system. I think some areas which, around the sustainability side of it is also probably thinking about scope creep as well. So if there is scope creep, what does that mean? What does that mean from an ethical perspective? What does that mean from a consent or the data? These types of things. And I think particularly that whole, the notions that you've been picking up, Lizzie, around, right to, first of all, consent to your data being there. I think that's fraught at the moment and not really well articulated or understood. I think also that idea of how do I take back my consent once my data's in the system or extract myself from the system that I have. I think that's very complex as well. So I don't think we've figured out that space, but I think that it's something which it's almost in my mind like a sense of maturity. And I think generally speaking, some organizations have a lot of maturity who are developing, designing, deploying these. Others are at a very, very early stage of it. And that's why I think we just need more of these conversations. So those organizations that might be jumping on the bandwagon and don't even know what they don't know in terms of the appropriate way to use these, and perhaps the government at the time of robo-debt was at an earlier stage of maturity. I think now that they've certainly learnt from those from that lesson. Yeah.
What do you think they've learnt then, Nicole?
Well, the government's changed for start. I'm not sure. I think to your point, I mean, I think yes, it achieved perhaps some of the objectives that were set at the time by that government. I would say that the long-term outcomes were probably not what the government really wanted or anticipated, and it's clearly had a lot. But I think that also speaks to the broader context that this is done. I mean, that's one of the reasons we've chosen to study trust in AI in public sector, because we see the risks there as perhaps the greatest. One, because you can never take political ideology and objectives out, and the way that our system operates, there's not that many ways from a governance perspective to take that out of the system. So that's where we always have to be, I think, concerned. But then the scalability, the fact that it's often with vulnerable populations, and the fact that these are often essential services with no opt-out, to me, they're all the things that sort of escalate the risk there, and therefore the importance of studying trust.
Okay, so we had another question. I think I see the microphone is the back. So we'll have your question first, and then we'll come down to the front next.
I was just interested in throwing in the opposition between, conceptual opposition between concrete and abstract. I was thinking of Lizzie's point about people having a right to be treated as individuals. What's the difference between an individual and a mass in the way that an ADM would treat it? It's got a lot to do with concreteness. An individual is a concrete being that you might see in front of you. And I think a lot of a lot of problems around trust have got to do with the visibility of where the decision is made. It's not so much what decision is made or what the system of accountability around it might be, but can I see the person who's making the decision, and can I see them making it and try to judge that decision-making process? It called to mind also, Kath, your thing about negotiating consent and describing what at one time might have been called courtship, which is sort of like, how much do I reveal? I reveal more, and there's this kind of dialogic relation between two people, but they're quite present to each other. They're quite concretely available to each other, and they can see the decision that's being made and judge, are they going too far or are they not, as against the much more abstract thing of a tick box or something like that. So I just wondered if those terms are useful, thinking about concrete and abstract as sites in which decisions are made, and the trust that might adhere in one case or the other case. Because I suspect that many people are distrustful of very abstract decisions that they can't quite easily see in front of them.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, I must say, of like legislative versus court-based or judge-made law, because legislatures are elected by people generally, and then they're given the authority to make a set of rules. And then how you interpret those rules in accordance to individual circumstances can look very different to what you assume was intended by that law. So when you write a program for making a decision, you may do it with an objective in mind, and you might have worked with data and the like to do so, but then you haven't necessarily accounted for every individual circumstance. Invariably, you cannot, right? Because that's sort of what you're trying to do. You're trying to automate the process rather than make the decisions one by one. And so you need the function of courts, which are individuals as opposed to the majority, coming before a tribunal to make a decision about their circumstance and how you apply the law there, or whether they should be given a reprieve. And so that's how it works at a meta level in legal terms socially. And I sort of think we should try to duplicate that or replicate those kinds of functionalities if we're going to do it in a more micro scale. I don't think it's just good enough to say, well, these are superior to human decision-making processes, which, I mean, in many instances they are, but in many instances they also reveal what is perhaps wrong with human decision making. So you need that feedback loop to incorporate the experiences of individuals that you couldn't have possibly accounted for. I mean, sometimes you can, but there will be instances you have to expect to fail, I think. And so then you have a process in place to deal with that. So I think there is some utility in thinking about it as in that conceptual way, because that's how we've dealt with some of these problems at a more social level. And I think we should be aiming to do the same thing here, rather than just assume that those problems will get sorted out in the wash, Yeah. Sorry, Kath, did you want to say something?
No, I was just thinking about how terrible the courts are for dealing with sexuality and gender. And how the last thing, like some dude at the front of the room, and whether, I think some of the, and again, thinking about the dating app issue. So we were consulted by a dating app company after our project, and they were developing an app, and they wanted to know about safety and offensiveness and all these kinds of things. And one of the things they thought would be great with this app was that everyone on the app should be able to see everyone else on the app, and that would make it fair and great. And we were going, okay, thinking of the app as a space, like, what do you think the difference is like between a sports bar in the CBD and a queer bar in why isn't everyone all in the same bar looking at everyone? Like, why are there these different spaces? So I think, I don't necessarily probably have the faith in the legal system that you do.
Oh, sorry, I mean, I should put that in the same right there. I'm not sure I've got faith in the system, but I think at a structural level, that's why it's designed that way, as in to balance the rights of the majority with the rights of an individual. But I appreciate that in practice, that's not how it works. I mean, that's why you have lawyers, isn't it, to argue about this stuff, because it's not always clear. But the alternative is that we assume that we've thought of everything, and that the automated process is therefore superior to what exists. And that, I just think, is the prevailing presumption in a society as a result of the digital revolution. I think we need to debunk that. Maybe we're further advanced in that debunking than I give us credit for, but to my mind, there's still a huge investment in the neutrality of these processes, particularly by governments who want to present that as superior and conceal another agenda.
Okay, next question.
I'm wondering whether in the context of ADM, the problem might be that there's too much trust rather than there's not enough trust. And possibly there's too much unwarranted trust because we're quite happy to make ourselves vulnerable, which is the first part of that definition. But the thing on the other side hasn't got our best interests at heart, right? That's the bit that's missing. So it's an unwarranted trust, or maybe there's just enough trust, good enough, maybe call it good enough trust. It's not real trust, but it's sort of good enough that it balances out convenience, against convenience, etc. Is the problem really not how we increase trust? It's really how we decrease trust in some of these things.
I can jump in, but do you want to go?
No, you can.
So I think, I mean, from a rational perspective, we say trust should be based on good reasons, right? But then norms also come into it. Everyone's on Facebook. So even though I don't trust it, how do I keep in contact with the people that are on that? And that's the only platform that they use. So this is where I think a really important conversation for trust, which at least in the literatures that I'm familiar with is quite absent, is this motivation to trust. And I think that, that manifests as convenience. And so I'm not at all saying it's as simple as a cost benefit kind of the benefits, that because I think sometimes we do it, but when the benefits to us, often from an emotional perspective, outweigh, or we've got a really strong pull there to want to use it, even though rationally we know that we might be giving our data away, it might be used in manipulative ways, etc. I think, just from a very pragmatic stance, I do think that the more that we can educate people, the more that people understand, so when social media companies came out, there was nothing like it, right? People just didn't even know what the risk is. They didn't know the business model. And now we're so much more educated and you can see, but it's still normative and people started using it. So not everyone, even if they don't trust it, will step away from that. So that's what I mean about the complexity of kind of trust with it. But I definitely think that's a key consideration.
Yeah, I'm also on Facebook and don't trust it. But this is where I think this idea of mistrust being generative comes into play. And I think we need to, I don't like the idea of building trust. I think, again, it makes it this like really concrete material thing. I think we need to keep it like in that more ephemeral, like affective kind of space. They're thinking about like conjuring more mistrust out of the atmosphere. I think that's what we need to be encouraging. And again, like linking that back into more education is going to be really critical.
But I think it's also really, I'd say that there is a lot of distrust and mistrust out there at the moment. And certainly if you look at any of the poll data, you see that coming through. And that's warranted in many ways because some of our institutions have repeatedly failed us, etc. So I do think that it can be, and that is actually quite helpful, not only for the people that are distrusting, but that is sending a very strong message because no one wants to be distrusted or mistrusted and the institutions want to have our trust. So it actually does then provide the motivation for them to want to go, why do you mistrust or distrust? How do we fix this? So I think they're always that, and that's a very practical and I think really good approach.
And I think the interesting thing there is that we have such a focus on trust, but as your work shows, Nicole, discover distrust. And I think that's there's a very interesting question there around actually, as Emma's been saying as well, understanding a little bit more about what it means to distrust rather than always putting the focus on the other side, which is really interesting. So we've got a couple more questions coming up. I see that the microphone is down here at the front and the next question is up there on the top, my right-hand corner as well. So you can go ahead, Jason.
Great. Thank you for a really fascinating panel. So I'm Jathan Sadowski, by the way. So I'm wondering as well about some of the kind of the politics of trust, building on this discussion. I think it's a really interesting one between the I don't trust this thing, but it's become so normalized or so socially required that I have no choice but to use it. And I'm thinking in particular, in my work, I just read a paper last week about trust in the insurance industry. And it was an empirical paper doing a big nationally representative survey of people in the US, and it found that the more insurance literacy you have, and the more insurance information you get from online sources versus newspaper sources, the lower your trust in the industry. So in other words, the more you know about the insurance industry, the least you trust it. And I think we see the same thing with finance. We see the same thing with the military, right? We see the same thing with all these big institutions. That's like the more you know, the least you trust it. But also, you gotta have insurance, right? You gotta have a bank account. You really, you have no choice but to have a military, right? And so I wonder, like, is there political power to be found in mistrust of these institutions that have become so big and so unable to be refused? Like, is there political power to be found in that mistrust, or is it the fact that, like, these institutions, trust doesn't really matter? Like, yeah, they want it because it's nice, but like ultimately it's not a threat to them if you don't trust them, right? Like, they'll still keep chugging along. Like, I think it's an open question. I would love to hear everyone's thoughts.
Can I ask though, do you think there's a potential downside to that mistrust, as in it's potentially a, I mean, I'm asking you now, but I don't know whether you're handling it like that. But, you know, isn't that also a basis for kind of, you know, like authoritarianism, to say that I don't trust any institutions? I have no naivety about good faith. And so how do you then convince anyone to take any kind of, any investment in society or social institutions? That's sort of my concern. I mean, maybe I'm just a lawyer and believe in the legal system, but he's objecting at least. But, you know, like, I do think you need to have a system that works in some ways to be able to build a coherent sense of society. But I also understand your question in that the mistrust is pretty important to holding powerful people to account. I mean, what do you think about the basis for authoritarianism?
Well, I mean, authoritarianism is not binary either, right? Nor is domination or any other relation of power. Like elements of authoritarian relations exist within democratic societies, right? Because we don't have ultimate autonomy and say over everything. Like, we do have to subject ourselves to institutions that have power over us. And so I think that my question is that one of, like, in an authoritarian society, we would say, like, the trust of the public or the legitimacy of the public doesn't matter, because the institution in power has such a total power that they don't need that trust. Nominally, in a democratic society, that power is founded on the legitimacy and trust bestowed on it by the public. But we also have institutions that act and behave in autonomous ways in democratic societies that don't require us to have trust in them in this way. And so I think my question is more of that, like what political power can be found in mistrust or in vocalizing that I don't trust this or that I do trust that? Like, is there political power to be found in that kind of affect or collective agency, or focused on trust as an issue?
So I think there is. And if I use like the Royal Commission into the banking and finance sector as an example of that, so I would say that there was power in the fact, I mean, what is a Royal Commission? It's essentially saying, we don't have any confidence or faith that you will operate as an industry and meet public expectations anymore, right? So we're going in and we're going to, and I would say from what I've seen and heard, it has made a difference. It wasn't just a, you know, whitewash on that. Like, financial firms, the regulation, everything has fundamentally changed from that. And I would say that now the public is in a much better position, consumers on the whole. But I also would say, well, trusting institutions to do what? Most people still trusted the banks to have their savings in there and for their ATM card to work and credit card fraud, which uses AI, you know, all of that to still work, but they weren't necessarily trusting that they weren't being oversold things or sold things that weren't, you know, actually going to deliver on the services that they were paying for, etc. So I think it's important to, you know, trust really is, you know, a person or, you know, trusting, or a group trusting in something to do something. And I think that's part of the complexity of trust in ADM as well. We may trust it in some ways, but not in other ways. So I don't think it fully answers your question, but I think at the underlying of your question, I think there's this thing of, is there power in it? And I think absolutely. I'm a bit concerned about how much there is a narrative of saying we don't trust any of our institutions, when actually some of our institutions are operating pretty well, not perfectly, but, you know, I actually think most of us still do trust doctors here in Australia. We still do trust police. We still do trust a lot. Universities are very trusted. Researchers are trusted. So And I think that's where we get spillover effects too. So like in the work that we've been doing, looking at healthcare, you know, like AI for melanoma use and that, like there's so much trust built in because we already had all the systems in place. We've got ethical review boards. We've got people who know what they're doing from a research. They're never going to release it unless it's fully tested and validated. So we've already got in all these assurance mechanisms to make sure that anything at the out, because it's a high reliability industry. I think it's more of a concern when ADM is being used in, say, sex tech or social media, all these institutions that don't have all of those mechanisms at multiple levels to kind of assure trustworthiness, if you like.
Okay, so we have our next questions up there.
Thanks so much to the panel for such a nuanced discussion on trust. My question kind of connects to the earlier one, but I'm thinking about automated decision-making systems that are kind of being set up to solve public problems. And I'm thinking about what your thoughts might be on trust at an individual level and trust at a collective level in the context of these kinds of systems that are proposing to, solve public problems. So what are the ways by which we could think about trust at a social or a collective sense?
I might jump in here just quickly. As part of the transport work I'm doing, I'm working really closely with a Melbourne feminist tech startup called She's a Crowd, who are doing very similar work. I don't know if anyone caught the train or the trams have seen any of the advertisements from Vic Police trying to gather stories of gendered violence. And yeah, it's a garbage public health campaign, in my opinion. It looks, I have zero interest in texting Victorian police about any instances I have on transport, and there are many. However, in contrast, so I would say that that is a very collective approach and a very bad public health attempt and intervention. The She's a Crowd work, however, is done at a much more individual and inclusive level. So if you jump onto their website, they've done a lot of work to make sure different, what I would say, like different colors and lumpy, bumpy, beautiful bodies are included on that space. There are disabled folks, there are queer folks and trans folks. It's a completely different approach, and it's an approach that the CEO and the different women who work there, who have jumped on social media, who have done a lot of work over the past 2 years to create a level of trust with the Australian public that means that people are comfortable in sharing these instances, that I don't believe, and I'm making a prediction, that the Victorian police approach will not have that level of success.
Anybody else want to speak to that question? So let's move back down. Oh, you already have it. Good. All right.
Sorry.
Next question.
Stole the mic. Just following on from Jathan's question. We've been talking about systems that are used directly by the public or that directly affect the public, but how do we get public buy-in to trust in recommender systems that are used, say, in policing, judging, medical, social systems, where it's going through to somebody else, but there tends to be a default to trust the AI? Or is public buy-in actually necessary?
Can I just ask you a question again? Do you need to have public trust to deploy these systems, or can you convince them as a matter of putting them into practice? Have I misunderstood?
It just seems that there seems to be a level of trust by, I assume, that there is an assumed level of trust by the people who are using recommender systems. They've been using them for a while, it seems to work. And there just seems to be no sort of follow through into the public. It's a Wizard of Oz behind the curtain sort of thing that we don't get to see or we don't know about unless you know about it. So I'm just wondering if, is public buy-in or is public trust necessary for these systems, or do we just trust in the institutions to get it right?
That's a good question. I think one of the, sorry, keep
No, you go.
I'm just filling in time.
I'm just thinking about it. Go on, you go.
So I think, if I understand correctly, like decision support tools, is that, yeah. So, I mean, I do think that typically in these, it may not be all the way across, but I think best practice in building those tools is to consult widely with the groups that will be affected by it. So, you know, citizen panels and things like that. And if that's not happening, then it certainly should be happening. In some of the ones that we've researched, we certainly know that that has happened. And I think it also depends on the purpose again. So I'm thinking about one like where it's been used in New South Wales Revenue, where the whole idea is essentially that when people have fines and there's garnishee orders to repay those fines, this system actually helps them to identify when people may be experiencing some vulnerability, so they can intervene to take away the garnishee orders and enable a fuller assessment of it. And there's also, you know, humans in the loop whenever a certain level is flagged. So the purpose of that is to do good. Do you know what I mean? It's almost the opposite of robo-debt, right? So I think that's where probably the public are pretty accepting of that, because like, it can't do too much harm. Do you see what I mean? Whereas in another context, if it's being used to make decisions, I think it depends. Like, I think human in the loop, and when that's really maintained in a very real and authentic way, I think the public is calmer about it. People are more accepting with it. But I think there's always the risk there that people become de-skilled, and even though there's still a human in the loop, they do just become heavily reliant on it. And so I think there are still some concerns that could potentially come in. I hope that answers to some extent.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about an answer to that question, because it feels like having a universal answer is probably not appropriate. It's kind of specific in some ways, but my instinct is to say, no, we should not trust these institutions to do this. And I'm trying to think of an example where that ought not be true, but to use a double negative like a lawyer. But what I'm thinking of is, you know, the New South Wales Police have used facial recognition technology, even though we know that facial recognition technology is probably no better than someone who has standard sight. It's not at the level that it can be used meaningfully, but we know that they used it on they did a trial run using Clearview AI, very unethical company. But, you know, in those circumstances, there's no regulation of biometric information or systems of biometric identification in Australia. There was a proposal put forward a couple of years ago, which was scrapped, or the recommendation was that it be scrapped by a bipartisan committee, so including people from the government at the time, the LNP government, because there wasn't sufficient privacy and rights protections in it. That biometric bill was then taken off the table. Now we have lawlessness, essentially, in the use of biometrics in Australia. And that, I do not trust institutions to do that well. So I do think we need law, partly as a way of holding institutions to account, but also so the public can be aware of what is being used and how, and there can be system guardrails set up even on the intense appetite of the public sector to make money from these kinds of industries, you know, these emerging technologies. So I don't know that we can trust institutions to do that work. I mean, I'm conscious that you're right, Nicole. I think the police is one of the most trusted institutions in society, but I certainly wouldn't trust them to deploy these kinds of technologies. You know, there's a great example that I think it was Georgetown found of some cops using a facial recognition system in the US. It was a robbery in a bodega in New York, and they passed the image through their facial recognition database and found no matches. And then one of the cops thought that the guy who was accused of a crime looked like Woody Harrelson, so they put a picture of Woody Harrelson through the database. And then found a match and arrested the guy. And, you know, I don't know what happened to that man. I don't know whether he took a plea and is now serving time. I don't know. But the point is that institutions are full of people who have their own agendas. And even if the system is designed really well and the data is impeccably sourced, there's going to be a human decision maker there that has their own motivations. And unless there's scrutiny of those decision makers using these systems, I don't think we should be trusting them. And I think public accountability is one of the few ways in which you can import some scrutiny onto those systems, whether it's through exposure by journalists and the like, or whether it's through legislative processes where we all kind of collectively come together and determine the guardrails. I'm not convinced that without it, these systems will work. So yeah, that's where I land.
I think it really comes back also to the question, are we even asking the right question of, you know, do we trust AI? Do we trust ADM? Actually, do we trust the power relations and the societies and the people by whom we're surrounded? You know, technology itself is not necessarily inherently trustworthy or distrustworthy, of course. So we now have which I think will be our final question down here at the front.
Thank you. I'm Michael Richardson from UNSW. I think this builds a little bit on what you were just saying, Sarah. In the military technology space where I do a lot of my research, trust is a really big topic, but it's not trust of the people who are going to be subject to the technologies that matters. It's trust as to whether the people operating them can feel confident that they're going to carry things out in a way that is firstly going to protect them from international law, and secondarily going to help them achieve their mission outcomes. So consultation is extensive, testing and verification is extremely extensive, but no one asks the people who are going to be bombed whether like they're happy with the levels of safeguards put in place, right? And yet trust is mobilized as this really important concept, and it's part of the kind of economy of the way the industries work. And so I'm just wondering about whether like how you find trust being utilized in different ways by different actors, and whether that kind of competing conception of what trust is and where it matters is kind of part of the problem here, because it means so many different things to in different contexts where ADM matters. Just a small question.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so I guess that comes back to some of what I was talking about before, that, you know, really mapping out the stakeholders who are affected by a technology use, and as a starting point to understand. And then, yes, there'll be different trust relationships in there because it's different actors with different interest motives, etc., who are affected differently by. So I think essentially it comes back to the fact that they have different levels of vulnerability, and also the agency deploying it. So the defence, like you said, they really don't care about, to some extent, the people that this is going to ultimately be used on, because they're the enemy anyway. And, you know, the whole objective is to overcome the enemy, presumably, as one. I know defence do a lot more than that, but in a very simple terms. But I think that that has to be the starting point of it, is mapping that out. And certainly in our work, we see very different, and sometimes they're competing. So, you know, for a public sector agency, from a managerialist perspective, cost savings, potentially better decisions, you know, greater efficiency, that saves the public money. You know, it's very easy to justify the use of this, and there are really good benefits from it. You can't deny those. But then also, are they looking at it from the flip side in terms of who is it going to be impacted? How do we defend individuals, even though it might be good for the majority, but is it for... So it's complex, and that's what I think is inherent in this. In many ways, I would say it parallels general trust management, for want of a better word, of any kind of organizations doing any services or systems or processes or anything. I mean, technology, many of the dynamics are the same. And yet I think, again, generally organizations haven't necessarily been really thinking about, well, how do we go about conducting our activities to ensure that there is some level of trust, or, and when I say trust, I mean both ends of the spectrum, or that there's distrust that we need to pay attention to and understand why that is and what that might mean for us and how we can learn from it.
There is one example, I'll just, if you'll indulge me, there's a great example from a few years ago of Project Skynet, which was, I can't believe it's called that, where the US military was using mobile phones to identify targets in the tribal regions in Pakistan for lethal drone attacks. And there's this, they would identify a target based on who that mobile phone number would associate with, and then they would determine that to be a legitimate and not indiscriminate target under humanitarian law and bomb that person. You know, and the drone wars were notorious because people were killed multiple times, huge casualty rates associated with the target. But there was also one guy who was caught up in it whose mobile phone number was selected as a target, and he was an Al Jazeera journalist because he travelled throughout the tribal regions to talk to people involved in the conflict. And then, of course, the US military allocated him the status as a potential enemy combatant and had him on the list, the kill list. And, he wrote about, like, it sounds ridiculous, right? And of course, any human looking at this would be able to figure it out. But he's like, this is my life, I could have been killed in a lethal drone attack based on an automated system that put my phone number in the mix without human oversight. And this is who needs to trust that system. It's a pitch to the American public that that's a moral war, that it's not taking out unnecessary targets, that it's dealing with the threat of terrorism, that Americans feel comfortable that that's an ethical way of conducting a targeted assassination program, and it creeps into then international law that this is acceptable. And okay, so can we trust that? No, but you know, I think there is different audiences that these things are pitched to, and that is very important to remember when these absurd examples come out, because I don't think the US military would have cared if they killed an Al Jazeera journalist. You know, they've got track record doing this stuff, but they do care whether the public is up for war and what that looks like. And it is a very critical thing that you raise, that trust is that the pitch of that you can trust this technology is different to different cohorts.
Just to build on what you were saying, Nicole, in addition to stakeholder mapping, I think what we really need to do is take these technologies in the development process and get it into the everyday level and really pull out those like complicated, messy, contingent circumstances. Because that's where, if we want to talk about trust being built, that's where it's built, right? It's built in those kind of ongoing contingent circumstances and moments. I'm thinking, Sarah, about the research Vikey's doing over in Sweden with Volvo and the driverless cars. And doing that research in the car, so doing those driving ethnographies with people and getting an understanding of their everyday lives and experiences, and understanding, you know, what's important and what's happening. And, you know, the solutions that are being presented, you know, sorry, the problems that are being presented, are they even problems for people that they're trying to, you know, pour millions of dollars into?
Yeah, I mean, I think our research in Sweden has shown that when people drive Wizard of Oz self-driving cars, that trust is not something that they kind of transactionally give, you know, or invest in a car. Trust is something, as Nicole said, it's very dynamic, and trust comes and goes. You might trust the car in a particular part of the road. You might not trust the car to perform specific tasks in another part of the road. So trust is never something that's constant, that's given, donated to a tech or donated to an organization by a person or by a public. Trust is something that emerges in contingent circumstances, and this is very, very dynamic, very changing, and so difficult to capture. And anyway, I could go on for a very long time. Please read my chapter in the Everyday Automation book. But trust is absolutely fundamental to our ethics. Fundamental to the way that we understand our relationships with technology and organizations and institutions and everything that happens around technology. So we mustn't forget about it. We mustn't take it for granted. We mustn't just consider it to be something that will be given or taken away, or that's transactional in that way. We need to keep thinking about it. We need to keep debating it, and keep this dialogue going amongst ourselves. So please join our Trust in Automated Decision Making network in the centre. Sign up to Emma's reading group, speak to us and continue this conversation with us. We're very, very keen to keep this trust work going and develop a set of discussions, publications and reports on this work as we go forward. So thank you very much, our fantastic panelists and our wonderful audience, and hope we'll keep on talking.